Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 14th chapter of Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. We're going to try and make it all the way up until the 25th verse. In order to make it that far, we're not going to have a whole lot of time to do an elaborate pre-lesson, but the 14th chapter continues and puts the capstone on the Paul's extensive elaboration on the spiritual gifts, which begins in the 12th chapter. And as he explains there are many kind of gifts, but the same Spirit. So the theme of plurality and unity repeats itself in the body of Messiah analogy, which comes after the 12th verse, which forms the second section of that chapter. But we just want to say in the first section, which is up to verse 11, the Spirit distributes his gift. Everyone has one. Every believer has at least one. They're listed in verses 8 through 10. But he does it according to his sovereign purposes. But this does not eliminate just because he is sovereign doesn't eliminate our need for responsible handling of what we receive from him. And then the theme of plurality and unity is continued in the 12th, the second section. For as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of that body being many are one body, so also is Messiah. So the church is his body, and just as he needed a body to minister on earth in his own lifetime, so too does, as the Son of God did, so too does the Spirit of God need a body, and we are that body, and we have many members. These are analogous and metaphorical to the respective gifts and offices which each must complete. And if one of us is hurt, for instance, if you break a finger, your whole body's going to ache, and it's not going to be a pleasant experience for your whole body. So we have to be mindful of the collective and use and resourceful with our spiritual resources, use them resourcefully so that there are no divisions in the body, but that the members should have the same concern one for another, just as, the brain doesn't want any member of the body to be hurt, because that means the whole body's going to hurt. But earnestly seek the better gifts, and yet I shall show you a more excellent way. So there is a hierarchy in these gifts, and the greatest gift of all is love, which forms the base of the 13th chapter. Without love, if you move mountains with faith, if you do miracles, if you do anything apart from love, it is as empty chatter and sounding brass and clanging cymbal, and the musical instruments are going to show up in the passage we're going to be covering today. But love, as he defines it, is completely devoid of anything selfish. It never fails, and whether and it outlives prophecy and all things. And also the 11th verse, we just want to read that. That's going to connect to the 20th verse in this chapter we're going to be covering today. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I thought as a child, I reasoned as a child, but when I became a man, I did away with childish matters. So this is his development of through discipline and maturity. So as Christians, we are to forsake childish traits, but have a childlike spirit, without which we cannot hope to access the kingdom of the heaven, as the Savior makes plain in the Synoptics. But what Paul is speaking of is childishness and immaturity. So all the vices associated to immaturity we are to avoid like the plague. But the good in the childlike awe and wonder and complete and natural and total trust, we are to cultivate. So we do want to differentiate it, and we'll elaborate more on that when we get to the 20th verse. If we get there, we're just going to close with the 13th verse. And now faith, hope, and love remain, these three, but the greatest of these is love. So love's supremacy and preeminence without even though these things are permanent, hope and faith, love is what gives meaning and substance and life and vitality and nutrients to everything that we are and everything that we do. First verse of the 14th chapter. Pursue love and earnestly seek the spiritual gifts, but rather that you prophesy. So there's three things we read here. He's continuing from the 13th chapter to pursue love, and he's connecting it to earnestly seek the better gifts in 12:31. But here he's just saying to pursue all the gifts in a spirit of love. This will give meaning and enrichment and substance and life to the exercise and the fruit that the spiritual gift can produce. But prophesy, he's going to, as I mentioned earlier, there is a hierarchy of gifts, and for the reasons that he explains and that we'll elaborate on, prophecy is a superior gift to tongues for reasons that we'll read out. For he who is speaking in a tongue does not speak to men, but to Elohim, for no one understands, but in the Spirit he speaks secrets. So the practice of speaking in tongues was a foreign language, unbeknownst to the holder. This was evidence that the Ruach Kodesh had visited them and given them the gift of tongues, which is the ability to, without necessarily any foreknowledge, to speak accurately a word of prophecy in another language. And this was functionally essential to the early assemblies, and it's not so much anymore because they had communication barriers that we can instantly overcome. But the word understands, I think it appears 12 or 14 times in the range we're trying to cover today. So understanding is essential. It gives meaning. If you don't know the meaning of the gift or the tongue or the contents, then you are none the wiser. But the Spirit, he can speak the secrets. He is the one who not only enables the tongue speaker, but also the tongue interpreter to know what to say and what they are saying. But he who prophesies speaks upbuilding and encouragement and comfort to men. So the word upbuilding is alternately translated as edifying. That is a term borrowed from architecture. It is the strengthening. So those who speak prophecy, and prophecy was pre-biblical preaching. It wasn't necessarily a prediction of the future in the New Testament, but it was speaking without without the Bible as a reference. So before the Bible was being composed, it hadn't even been compiled by the time Paul was writing this. But preachers in those days, in the early assemblies, would have preached from essentially a blank slate, only the Old Testament and just the what the Spirit had imparted to them there and now. So the Spirit who inspired the canon is all the authors of the New Testament and the Bible also inspired many early Christian preachers, and they offered edification, encouragement, and comfort. Those are three positive things that everyone needs, and it is a gift that they can provide through the exercise of their gift. So the gifts come to us, but they are not ours. They are not for our enjoyment. They are for corporate employment, and that's when we are given gifts in order to give gifts to others. We have to share what we have been given in order to make the most and even really enjoy or experience in a meaningful way having been gifted. He who is speaking in a tongue builds up himself, but he who prophesies builds up the assembly. So tongues is, the practice, the temptation for the abuse of this practice was that several believers thought it was a sign of spiritual maturity that they had been visited in tongues and that they had the gift, so they would flaunt it and use it as a spiritual pedestal, but they were only building up themselves, whereas the prophets, those who prophesied, those who spoke words that could be understood, he explains later in the 19th verse, were building up something beyond themselves and greater than themselves, the assembly, the collective, the body of believers, which is earlier metaphorically likened to a body in the 12th chapter, verses 12 through 27. Now I prefer you all spoke with tongues, but rather that you might prophesy, for he who prophesies is greater than he who is speaking with tongues, unless he interprets, so that the assembly might receive upbuilding. So Paul had nothing against the practice in its pure and pristine form of in the gift of speaking tongues, but he demoted it as something less useful and beneficial. The ability to speak a language that is unintelligible is less is less constructive than the ability to speak a word that has meaning and can be understood and absorbed and digest. So the one who speaks in tongue, they have to have someone who's got to identify the language and translate the message, and that's the word of prophecy given through another tongue to them for their singular location. But tongues, they can be upbuilding, and without them, Pentecost could have never happened, and they wouldn't have had 3,000 converts on Christianity's birthday. But over time, they just became abused, shall we say. But now, brothers, if I come to you speaking with tongues, what shall I profit you unless I speak to you, either by revelation, or by knowledge, or by prophecy, or by teaching? So Paul could speak all these things. He spoke in tongues. He mentions it himself in verse 18. But he'd also been receiving revelations, and he had the knowledge of the mysteries that were hitherto hidden. And he certainly prophesied. He makes several prophetic claims in reference to the end times and the latter days. And he was also, quite the teacher, too. So we look to him as a teacher. So he was adept in all these things, but tongues is at the bottom of the pile, and then revelation, knowledge, and all the rest are on top of it. Nevertheless, lifeless ones making a sound, whether flute or harp, if they do not make a distinction in the sound, how shall it be known what is played on the flute or on the harp? So lifeless ones are musical instruments. They have voices that become activated through physical motion, but they themselves are lifeless, and they have notations which give the listener the full range of that voice. But if they're only playing one chord repetitively in the same tone, no tonal diversity, no change of tempo, or any other ingredient in musical composition, what's the use? Because no one's going to understand it, much in the same way that tongues require the speaking and the interpretation thereof. For indeed, if the trumpet makes an indistinct sound, who shall prepare himself for battle? So the danger of a trumpet making an indistinct sound, the trumpet would have been an instrument of war to warn cities that there was enemy invaders and to summon armies. That is what trumpets existed for. But if the soldiers got the dubious, ambiguous message about whether to advance or retreat, then that would cause all host of calamities that were confusion induced, and they will run the wrong way or go the wrong direction. So also you, if you do not give speech by the tongue that is clear, how shall it be known what is spoken? For you shall be speaking into the air. So in the absence of an interpreter, an accompanying interpreter, one has to be present when one is speaking tongues, that the word of that tongues is cannot be known, and it's going in one ear but not in the mind. It's not being received or registered in the mind. So the tongue is a speaking in the spirit. That's evidence of the spirit, but it is not necessarily an illumination. Without the interpretation, they are the ones who give illumination. The Spirit's ministry of illumination enables us to make to give meaning and application that is valid to the scriptures that he inspired, and it also gives the interpreters of tongues the ability to understand what it is. That is one of the Spirit's ministry. It is to illuminate, bring light, make known, understand. Remember, that word's going to show up. There are undoubtedly so many kinds of sounds in the world, and none of them is without significance. So all the signs and all sounds and the notes and the combinations of compositions, they're not necessarily better than any other. They are all equally in their own way, their own thing, and therefore individual and authentic. But the significance is going to make more sense as we read. If then I do not know with the power of the voice, I shall be a foreigner to him who speaks, and he shall speak as a foreigner to me. So foreigners, there's a communicative chasm between foreigners and foreigners, because foreigners and natives are I guess you're both foreign to each other when you meet, regardless of whose turf you're on, but you're coming from different cultures, different backgrounds, and speak different languages. So without the interpretator, the one who is gifted with the gift of illumination in the assembly, it's as a foreigner speaking psychobabble. He could be saying the most intelligent thing in the world, but it's all going to sound meaningless and meandering and incomprehensible to you if you do not understand what he is saying. So that key concept of understanding comes in once more. So also you, since you are ardent for spiritual gifts, seek to excel in the upbuilding of the assembly. So this is the third time he's told them in that we've covered today, 12:31, and also the opening verse of this chapter, that he tells them to seek spiritual gifts, and he wants them to seek in the right direction with the right focus and concentration, and the appropriate direction and approach to that direction is the ones that can really build the collective, the ones that, if you can speak in tongues, that makes you look great, but it doesn't really build a whole lot of people up more. You may be able to put yourself on a pedestal, but there are better ones, and there are more meaningful and useful ones, and there is a hierarchy of gifts. Therefore, he who is speaking in a tongue, let him pray that he might interpret. For if I am praying in a tongue, my spirit is praying, but my understanding is without fruit. So prayer would have been combined in the speaking of the tongues. So if he's praying or just prophesying out loud in the tongue, Paul likely did this at least one point. He wasn't a big baptizer. He baptized one or two men in the first chapter in the Corinthian assembly, but the concept that is communicated here is that the Spirit may be active and alive and working its wonders in you and through you, but your mind is meaningless, it is blank, it is empty, it is void, it is vain, it is futile, without the understanding of what the tongue precisely means, the language, the noise. What then is it? I shall pray with the Spirit, and I shall also pray with the understanding. I shall sing with the Spirit, and I shall also sing with the understanding. So the Spirit is all well and good, but without the understanding, we are to worship him in spirit and in truth. We read of in John 4:23 and 24. So one without the other is, if you want the whole, the complete and total whole, you're going to have to seek both. It's not enough to have the Spirit without knowing. So there is a cognitive dimension that adds meaning and life and vitality and substance to the spiritual element. But, I've often sat in rooms and in different countries and heard different languages, but I've been able to discern somewhat the spirit of what is being said because, gentle words are presented gently no matter what language they're in, whereas loud and abrasive ones are. So there is a spiritual element. I haven't the slightest idea what they're saying, but I know it's probably something harmless, something wholesome, and, something good or funny or anything else. Otherwise, if you bless with the Spirit, how shall he who fills up the place of the unlearned say, Amen, at the giving of thanks, since he does not know what you say. So the Spirit without understanding, if you're speaking in the Spirit and not knowing what you're saying, how is someone who is unlearned from a completely blank slate and knows next to nothing is going to be able to affirm in unison? That is what amen means. If and when they give the expression of gratitude, the collective one, and if he does not know what you say, how can you expect him to respond to that desired effect? For if you truly give thanks well, but the other is not built up, I thank my Elohim, I speak with tongues more than you all, but in an assembly I prefer to speak 5 words with my understanding, that I might instruct others, also than 10,000 words in a tongue. So to the practice of giving thanks, he connects it to himself. He gives thanks that he spoke tongues more than anyone else. But for all the tongues that he was visited with, Paul was, he didn't brag about this gift, but he really demoted it to, if he was in an assembly as he is now, as is anyone who is reading this words to an assembly, the value of 5 words that are legible, 5 words that are comprehensible, 5 words that are received, absorbed, digested, and applied are more meaningful than all the words in the world, not just 10,000, but really infinity. If you don't know what is being said, then none of it is sinking into you, no matter how many words, without the knowledge and the understanding of what is being said. You can't really instruct others if there's a communicative chasm between what you're saying to them and what they are not receiving. So all in all, he'd rather speak. He could get more mileage out of 5 words correctly spoken, consistent with truth, and inspired by the Spirit than 10,000 words that were in a tongue, which are were inspired by the Spirit, but without meaning, it's not really useful or beneficial to anyone else. Brothers, do not be children in understanding, but in evil be children, and in understanding be perfect. So remember 1 Corinthians 13:11, as I was a child, I discarded the childish things. So here, the children, now the Messiah says, ye must be as children in order to receive the kingdom like a child to be inherited. But Paul's telling us here, don't be like children in understanding. Now what Yahshua is talking about is faith. Be like children in faith, but children don't have the understanding, but they do have an ironclad, pure faith and total reliance and dependence. Don't waste years or days in being children, because every sin you indulge in adds up to another day of life lived in sin. So you want to spend your days as far away from and as free from sin. And in order to do that, you're going to have to perfect your understanding, and perfect understanding will elude you, but perfection is a process where we edify the existing structure and add on to progressive layers of understanding. But we can do none of this if we are childish in our approach to our spiritual walk. In the law it has been written, with men of other tongues and other lips I shall speak to this people, and even so they shall not hear me, says Yahweh. So this isn't exactly the law of Moses or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This is actually a citation from Isaiah chapter 28, verses 11 and 12. And this is in reference to the foreigners using other tongues that Yahweh used as an instrument to speak to his people were the Assyrians, who slaughtered and subjugated and scattered the northern kingdom of Israel, and even they even after all that he spoke to them through the pain and the chastisement and the discipline, they did not receive the message because their spiritual ears were not in tune to the language that he was speaking. Now he speaks to us in his word, but when that doesn't register, he speaks to us in his works. And these pagan, heathen, systematically savage Gentiles were instruments of the divine will to chasten his people, and it had a limited effect in accomplishing that purpose because, they were stubbornly wicked. So then tongues are for a sign, not to those who believe, but to unbelievers. And prophecy is not for unbelievers, but for those who believe. So tongues are effective as an evangelical ploy. That, remember, in the ancient Roman world, you had all these disparate cultures and cosmopolitan centers such as Rome or Corinth or Alexandria or, Ephesus or maybe a few other places where different languages were spoke, different cultures crossed, and different peoples and tongues and natives, just very immigrant dense, shall we say, people. The speaking of tongues would have, maybe invited the person in the room. They could sense it in their own language, the prophecy that was spoken to them, and those who were not of that ethnic background of the tongue in which it was spoken would have an interpreter there to give it meaning and translation in their life. But prophecy, it can't, I hate to, maybe I'm reading this passage wrong, but I believe that prophecy is not received by unbelievers, but it can turn a non-believer into a faithful one. But, I guess he's saying it cannot be received or given by unbelievers, so it is for those who believe, whereas tongues can be visited upon by those who are deficient in faith and spiritually immature, children in their walk. If then all the assembly comes together in one place, and all speak with tongues, and there comes in those who are unlearned or unbelievers, shall they not say that you are mad? So what would outsiders, people from the outside looking in, coming in, say to just a body of believers? If each person spoke their own tongue, there would be no edification, there would be no building of bridges or anything else, and this would cast an unfavorable impression even among the ignorant and uneducated, and those who do not share the faith will have cause to ridicule and reproach the assembly. But if all prophesy, and an unbeliever or an unlearned one comes in, he is reproved by all, he is discerned by all. So prophecy has the element of intelligibility that tongues lack. It is discerned by all. It is communicated and received for what it is, how it is spoken, and what is spoken is, there's no complexity to it in the audience's mindset. So that has the element of being universally observed in an audience in the way that tongues cannot. Tongues have a more limited scope of jurisdiction, and they are not as essential now as they once were, and nor were they even in Paul's day, at least compared to how they had been at Pentecost. One more verse. And so the secrets of his heart are revealed, and so falling down on his face, he shall worship Elohim, declaring that Elohim is truly among you. So the effect of being able to understand what is being said is the ability to really see and know and understand that Elohim is present among us. And the tragic fact is that most preachers lack the skill as preachers to communicate that that God is not only alive but present in their midst. They speak of him as a dead deity, and that's one of the things, because I'm not a preacher, but actually we don't have much time to get into that, but to tie it into seek the best gifts, the only way to discover if I do have the gift of preaching is to actually get out there, and that's an eventual goal. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Take care until next time. Take care until then. Bye-bye.